Ethan Walker learned early that money didn't just make life easier, it made people listen. He grew up in a house made of glass and sharp angles, perched on a hill that overlooked the city like it owned it. In the mornings, sunlight poured through the windows and reflected off marble floors. At night, the house glowed like a signal, proof that the Walkers were doing just fine, better than fine. Ethan's father ran a construction company that sponsored school events and city projects. His mother's name appeared on donation plaques, always engraved in clean, confident lettering. Ethan absorbed it all without realizing he was learning a lesson. Some people mattered more. At school, he moved through hallways like he belonged there more than anyone else. Teachers expected excellence before he earned it. Students laughed at his jokes out of instinct, like agreement was the safer option. Ethan wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. He smiled, raised an eyebrow, said just enough. And when he did, people paid attention. That's how he noticed Daniel Reyes. Daniel wasn't invisible, but he might as well have been. He sat near the window in most classes, back straight, but shoulders slightly folded inward, as if he were constantly bracing for impact. His clothes were clean, always clean, but worn thin at the elbows and knees. His backpack strap had been stitched together with black thread that didn't quite match. Daniel spoke rarely, and when he did, it was quietly. To Ethan, that silence felt like weakness pretending to be humility. The first comment slipped out almost accidentally. "Those shoes vintage, Daniel?" asked Ethan one afternoon. "Or family tradition?" The class laughed. Daniel didn't respond. That was the moment Ethan realized something important. No one was going to stop him, and Daniel wasn't going to fight back. Ethan leaned into his chair, satisfied. He didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a story that would follow both of them for the rest of their lives. Daniel Reyes learned early that silence was safer than explanation. At home, noise meant problems. The apartment he lived in with his mother was small and always smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and reheated food. The walls were thin enough that you could hear the neighbors argue, laugh, cry, sometimes all in the same night. Daniel learned to move quietly, to place things down gently, to exist without announcing himself. His mother worked 2 jobs, one overnight shift at a distribution warehouse, one early morning cleaning offices downtown. When Daniel woke up for school, she was usually asleep on the couch, shoes still on, exhaustion pulling her face tight. They didn't talk much in the mornings, not because they didn't care, but because there wasn't time. Daniel made his own breakfast, usually toast, sometimes nothing. He packed his lunch carefully, wrapping it in foil so it stayed warm, even though it rarely did. He hated how obvious store-bought food looked. Too shiny, too loud. At school, Daniel did his best to disappear, not because he lacked ambition, but because attention came with expectations he couldn't afford to fail. When teachers asked questions, Daniel usually knew the answers, he just didn't raise his hand. Being right felt dangerous, like it might invite scrutiny, or worse, humiliation. So he stayed quiet, watched, listened. That was how he noticed Ethan Walker long before Ethan noticed him. Ethan was impossible to miss. He spoke like the world owed him patience. He laughed like nothing had ever gone wrong in his life. When he entered a room, people adjusted themselves without realizing it. Daniel didn't hate him at first. He just observed him. And when the jokes started, small, sharp, aimed directly at him, Daniel told himself it didn't matter. They were just words. Words didn't change anything. But they did. They chipped away at something Daniel worked hard to protect, the idea that effort would eventually matter. When Ethan made jokes about his shoes, Daniel laughed softly along with everyone else. When he was called dead weight during group projects, Daniel did the extra work anyway, not to prove a point, but because he couldn't afford to fall behind. Failure wasn't an option. At home, there was no backup plan. Some nights, Daniel lay awake listening to his mother breathe unevenly on the couch, the sound of exhaustion heavy in the room. He stared at the ceiling and rehearsed futures in his head, college campuses he'd never seen, jobs he didn't understand, a version of himself who was always bracing for impact. School was supposed to be the way out. That's why the scholarship announcement mattered so much. Daniel read the notice 3 times to make sure it was real. Academic merit, financial need, limited spots. He qualified. He worked on the application at night, after finishing homework, after checking that his mother had eaten something before falling asleep again. He wrote essays about resilience without using the word, about responsibility without sounding bitter, about ambition without sounding desperate. He never told anyone he applied. Hope felt fragile, like something that could be taken if noticed. When Ethan's comments became sharper, more frequent, Daniel felt the timing wasn't accidental, but he still said nothing, because silence was what he knew. The day Ethan joked about his lunch, Daniel finally spoke back. "I like it," he said calmly. He didn't mean it as a challenge, but he saw something flicker across Ethan's face. Confusion, maybe, even irritation. That's when Daniel understood something important. Ethan didn't mock him because Daniel was weak. He mocked him because Daniel didn't need approval, and that unsettled him. When Daniel was called into the counselor's office days later, his stomach dropped. He didn't understand why at first. The questions were polite but pointed. His family income, his situation, whether everything he'd written was accurate. When he left the office, the hallway felt longer than usual. The scholarship went to someone else. Daniel didn't ask why. He already knew. That night he sat on his bed, tore up his application drafts slowly, and dropped them into the trash. He didn't cry, he didn't yell, he just felt tired. The next morning he still went to school, still sat by the window, still stayed quiet. But something had shifted. Daniel wasn't invisible, he was being erased, and no one, not even Ethan, noticed what kind of pressure was building inside him. The next morning, Ethan arrived at school with a grin that had nothing to do with the sun. His backpack was slung lazily over one shoulder, his shoes polished just enough to catch the light. He scanned the classroom like a predator measuring the prey before the hunt. Daniel sat at the same desk by the window, his notebook open, a pen poised over a page of neat lines. He didn't glance up. Ethan noticed the calm, the silence that had begun to irritate him more than before. "Hey, Daniel," Ethan began, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Did you make those sandwiches yourself again? I didn't know we were dating lunch." A ripple of laughter followed. Some of the classmates looked away, uncomfortable. Others whispered behind their hands, eager to join. Daniel didn't flinch. He just kept writing, his hand steady, the words flowing onto the page. Ethan leaned back, smirk widening. "Seriously, man, ever think about upgrading, or is foil your thing now? Vintage chic?" The laughter grew louder. Ethan basked in it, feeling the power of being the center, the one who set the mood. He didn't see the subtle shift in the room, the classmates who laughed uneasily, the ones who now avoided eye contact, the silence that Daniel wielded like a shield. It was a new kind of power, not the one Ethan thought he had, and that's what made it sting, because one day soon, the rules would change.
The notice board was buzzing with students, hands rifling through papers, eyes scanning names like hunters. Daniel moved quietly to the edge of the crowd, trying not to be noticed, trying not to hope too loudly. He had done everything right. Every assignment, every extra project, every late-night essay written with care. And yet, as the list of scholarship recipients was pinned to the board, he felt the familiar pit in his stomach. Ethan, of course, was already there, leaning casually against the wall, smug grin in place. He scanned the board, fingers tapping lightly as if reading a menu. When he spotted the names, he let out a low whistle. He murmured. Looks like someone didn't get the memo about winning. Daniel forced his eyes downward, scanning for his own name, and it wasn't there. A tight knot formed in his chest. The scholarship had gone to someone else, a student who smiled brightly, whose parents probably owned more than his apartment had ever seen, whose life wouldn't change much regardless of the award. Daniel clenched his fists under his bag, breath coming a little faster than normal. He didn't look at Ethan. He didn't want him to see the fire sparking in his chest. But Ethan noticed anyway. "Oh, don't look so serious, Reyes," Ethan said casually, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Guess all that late-night studying didn't quite cut it. Maybe next year." The cafeteria had gone quiet around them. Some students laughed nervously, others stared at Daniel, curious how he would react. Daniel closed his eyes for a second. He pictured his mother on the couch, exhausted, rising before dawn for another shift. He pictured his dreams stacked neatly in essays he had written alone at night, and then he opened his eyes. He said nothing. Nothing at all. Ethan's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Silence wasn't weakness. It was a quiet defiance. The next days were worse. Rumors circulated, some whispered by jealous classmates, some by teachers who didn't understand. "Did you hear? Reyes almost had the scholarship," they said, but someone got it instead. Ethan leaned into the gossip, repeating phrases like ammunition. "Guess some people are just better at luck than work," he said once, loud enough for Daniel to hear. "Some people just know how to charm the right teachers." Daniel didn't respond. He just kept walking past, head down, clutching his bag tighter than usual. At home, he tore open the envelopes he had received in the mail, rejections from universities, scholarship programs, and competitions. He stacked them neatly on his desk, a quiet monument to effort unrecognized. But even in his frustration, there was a spark, a determination that burned quietly out of sight. He wasn't invisible, he wasn't erased. Not yet. And when Ethan laughed a little too loudly in the hallways, thinking the damage was done, Daniel made a silent promise. One day, the world wouldn't get to define him. One day, the laughter wouldn't matter. But today, it still did, and the wound, sharp, unjust, bitter, was enough to leave a mark. The lights flickered in the classroom that morning, a brief stutter that made everyone glance up. For Daniel, it felt like a warning. Small, insignificant things had a way of stacking up, like tiny tremors before an earthquake. By lunchtime, the cafeteria had turned into a minefield. Ethan was there as usual, orchestrating the chaos like a conductor with a baton made of sarcasm. "Careful, Reyes," Ethan called across the room, voice dripping with amusement. "Wouldn't want your tray to fall apart under pressure. You'd ruin the whole aesthetic." The students nearest Daniel laughed, some nervously, others a little too eagerly. Daniel's lunch tray felt heavier than usual in his hands, his sandwich now a symbol of every small humiliation he had endured. He moved carefully, trying not to draw attention, but Ethan's shadow followed. "Watch it," Ethan said, stepping closer. "Or maybe I should just carry it for you. Wouldn't want a tragedy in the lunchroom today." Something inside Daniel snapped. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet tightening of every muscle. He stopped, turned. His eyes met Ethan's, steady, unflinching, carrying all the years of small indignities no one had noticed. Ethan laughed, a sharp, cutting sound. "What, can't take a joke?" Daniel's voice was low, calm, but there was an edge now that hadn't been there before. "It's not a joke to me." The room went silent. Some students froze mid-bite, others stared, unsure if they should intervene. Ethan's smirk faltered for a second. He was used to control, to laughter bending to his will, but Daniel wasn't bending, and that, more than anything, frustrated him. By the end of the day, Daniel could feel the exhaustion in his bones. Home wasn't refuge, it was just quieter walls. The electricity had been cut off in their building for a few hours earlier, a warning from the landlord that rent was overdue. His mother was exhausted, lying on the couch with eyes half closed, already dreaming of her next shift. Daniel sat on his bed, staring at the ceiling. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, the lost scholarship, the laughter, the small cruelty that had become a constant drumbeat. For the first time in months, he wondered if he could keep going. He considered skipping school. He considered not turning in the next assignment. He considered letting the world see him break. But deep down, beneath the fatigue and the humiliation, there was a flicker, a reminder that the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Because even in the darkest corners, some kind of hope had a way of surviving. And tomorrow, he would show up again, even if it killed him. The next morning, Daniel arrived at school feeling like he had already carried the weight of a week on his shoulders. His bag was heavier than usual, not from books, but from the invisible load of humiliation, exhaustion, and small betrayals that followed him like shadows. He moved through the hallway, trying to vanish into the crowd as always, when a hand touched his shoulder. "Daniel," said a voice he hadn't expected. He looked up. Mr. Alvarez, his history teacher, stood there, mid-40s, kind eyes, and a presence that seemed to hold calm in a chaotic world. "I noticed," Mr. Alvarez said softly, almost in a whisper. "What's happening with Ethan, with the scholarship situation, it's not right." Daniel froze. He wasn't used to adults noticing. He had learned early that hope was fragile, best hidden and best silent. Daniel started, unsure if he should speak. But Mr. Alvarez's gaze didn't demand words. It offered them. "You don't have to carry it alone," Mr. Alvarez continued, not to make it easier, but to make it fair. Daniel blinked. Relief and suspicion warred in his chest. Fairness didn't usually exist in his world, but Mr. Alvarez had always been different, quiet, observant, a teacher who looked past the loud, the flashy, the privileged. "I don't know if it matters," Daniel said finally, voice low. "Maybe not," Mr. Alvarez admitted, "but maybe it's not too late to make sure the next opportunity doesn't slip through your fingers. You've worked too hard, Daniel, and sometimes the world needs someone to notice." Daniel nodded slowly, a fragile weight lifting. He realized that for the first time in months, someone outside his family saw him, not just the quiet, obedient student, not just the kid who could be mocked, him. "Thank you," he said quietly. Mr. Alvarez gave a small smile. "Don't thank me yet. We'll make sure it counts. But you have to promise me something." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Promise me you'll keep showing up. Keep doing the work. Don't let them erase you. Not ever." Daniel looked at him, really looked, and for the first time he saw a lifeline in the middle of the storm. "I promise," he said. As Mr. Alvarez walked away, Daniel felt the spark rekindle, small, quiet, but undeniable. There was still a way forward, not easy, not guaranteed, but a way. And sometimes that was enough to survive another day. For a few weeks, Daniel held on to that quiet spark. He showed up every morning, assignments completed with meticulous care, and even smiled faintly when a classmate offered an encouraging word. The scholarship, or at least the hope of it, felt within reach again, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe a little bit. Then it all slipped away. It started with a phone call. Mr. Alvarez's face fell as he returned from the office, holding a letter in his hand. "Daniel, I'm sorry. There's been a change. The scholarship has been revoked." Daniel's stomach twisted. What? How? They said it was a clerical error, or maybe a decision from above. I don't know. I tried to argue, but he trailed off. Daniel clenched the envelope, the paper crumpling in his fists. It was official, final, irrevocable. All the nights spent writing, revising, hoping, they had counted for nothing. And then he heard the worst part, the reason. The school board had consulted with donors, and one name carried weight heavier than merit: Ethan Walker's father. Unintentionally, unknowingly, the man who had built his fortune on contracts and influence had destroyed Daniel's chance for escape. Daniel stared at the wall, numb. The injustice wasn't abstract, it was sharp, immediate, personal.
At home, he tried to talk to his mother, but she only shook her head, exhausted. "Don't let it stop you," she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her. There was nothing more she could do. At school, Ethan passed him in the hall. This time, he didn't need to speak. He didn't even look. The unspoken truth hung in the air. Daniel had been blocked again, pinned down by forces far beyond the classroom. Daniel kept walking, head down, heart heavy, a quiet fury building inside him. Mr. Alvarez caught up with him after class. "I'm sorry," he said again. "I really am. I wish it were different." Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence was enough to say everything: the unfairness, the exhaustion, the betrayal of every effort he'd poured into a world that refused to notice him. But in that silence, something else stirred, a realization. If the world wouldn't give him the chance, he would make it himself. And one day, the people who had tried to erase him would see that silence wasn't weakness. It was patience. It was waiting. And Daniel Reyes knew exactly how long he could wait. Ethan Walker had never missed a morning. His father's car, polished and gleaming, waited outside like a sentinel. His mother's voice floated through the halls, talking about charity events and upcoming galas, as if life itself had a predictable rhythm. Until it didn't. The first sign was subtle, a call from the bank, short, clipped, the kind of tone that made people pause without explanation. Then, the meetings. Papers shuffled in the study, voices lowered. "Things aren't looking good," his father muttered one evening, pacing the marble floors. Ethan laughed, a hollow sound, brushing it off. "We've always landed on our feet. Everyone says so." But the truth was creeping in. The next morning, the car that usually gleamed in the driveway wasn't there. Instead, an older model, scratched and tired, waited silently. Ethan frowned, brushing it off again. Weeks later, there was no car. The house was quieter, emptier, staff gone. The air smelled different, less polished, more ordinary. At school, Ethan noticed the change immediately. His friends no longer laughed at every joke. Teachers stopped calling on him with expectation. Even the cafeteria chatter shifted. He was no longer the center. And then came the whispers, some cruel, some curious, all sharp. "What did you hear about the Walkers? Bankruptcy? Right. Must be rough." Ethan felt the weight of attention he didn't want, not the kind he was used to. For the first time in his life, influence, money, and charm were powerless. The Walkers' world, a world Ethan had taken for granted, was crumbling around him, socially, financially, emotionally. Invitations vanished, opportunities disappeared, privilege no longer protected him. And as he sat in the quiet of his new, smaller apartment, staring at the bare walls where trophies and accolades used to gleam, Ethan realized something he had never understood before. People notice how you treat others. That doesn't vanish when wealth does. And some people, like Daniel, never forgot. Ethan Walker had always believed the world belonged to people like him, not just rich, not just popular, people like him. He had a place in every room, every hallway, every conversation. Attention was his currency, and he spent it freely. Until it wasn't.
The first sign came quietly, a call from the bank, then another. His father's voice, usually calm and commanding, was tight, edged with tension. "If the banks pull out, we're done." Ethan laughed it off. They had always landed on their feet. Everyone said so. But then the cars stopped showing up. One day it was an older model, scratched and tired. Weeks later, there was no car at all. The house on the hill, glass, marble, perfection, was sold. Suddenly, Ethan's name meant nothing. Invitations vanished. Teachers no longer smiled when he entered the classroom. Classmates who had once hung on his every word barely glanced his way. He tried to assert himself, to joke, to remind people who he was, but the laughter he relied on didn't come. The smiles he expected weren't there. Privilege had a price, and now he was paying it in full. The sharpest blow came when he saw Daniel Reyes, steady, composed, confident. Daniel walked past him one afternoon, backpack over one shoulder, head held high. He didn't glance at Ethan, didn't hesitate, didn't even acknowledge the boy who had made his life miserable for years. For the first time, Ethan felt what it was like to be irrelevant, invisible, replaceable. At home, the collapse was total. No staff, no luxury, no effortless admiration, only silence, only the bare walls of an apartment that felt smaller every day. The trophies and accolades he had taken for granted seemed like relics from a world that no longer existed. And in the quiet, Ethan realized something he had never understood before. The way you treat people, the arrogance, the cruelty, the small jokes meant to belittle, doesn't disappear when money does. Some people, Daniel Reyes among them, remember, and some people, like Ethan, would learn that the world could move on without them. Ethan's world had shrunk. The glass house, the polished cars, the effortless attention, they were gone. In their place was a small apartment, fluorescent lights that flickered and walls that felt too close. Every morning he woke to the hum of a reality that didn't bend to him anymore. He tried, he really did. Jobs he once would have laughed at, retail, clerical work, temporary office shifts became his life. He learned how to fold boxes, answer phones, carry spreadsheets he barely understood. Each day ended with exhaustion and the bitter taste of invisibility. He almost succeeded sometimes, almost got promoted, almost impressed a boss, almost found respect, but almost wasn't enough, not in the world he had been used to. Meanwhile, Daniel moved quietly, steadily. Scholarship applications, internships, volunteer work, he ticked off boxes in silence, never boasting, never calling attention to himself. Every step he took was deliberate, calculated, and invisible to those who didn't care to look. Years passed. Their lives ran in parallel lines that seemed to never intersect. Ethan struggled to keep up with bills, deadlines, and his own pride. Daniel rose steadily, unnoticed by most, but unstoppable in ways Ethan couldn't comprehend. Then, one night, something changed. Ethan, scrolling aimlessly online, saw it. Daniel Reyes. The name jumped off the screen. A feature article highlighting his success. A startup in financial analytics, scholarships, awards, recognition. The Daniel he remembered, the quiet boy at the back of the classroom, had become someone else entirely, someone untouchable. His chest tightened. He closed the tab, opened it again, stared at the picture of Daniel in a sharp suit, calm and confident. His own life, a series of almosts, felt like a cruel contrast. He tried to push it away, told himself it didn't matter, but it did. It burned. And somewhere deep inside, he knew the paths would cross again. Not by chance, not by kindness, by inevitability. Because some debts, no matter how quietly they are incurred, demand repayment. Ethan's fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitant. He wasn't looking for Daniel, not really, just curiosity, he told himself. A name that had once been inconsequential, a quiet shadow at the back of the classroom. And yet, there it was, Daniel Reyes. The search results were everywhere. Articles, profiles, accolades, a rising star in financial analytics, scholarships, internships, awards, a startup that had investors knocking on his door. The calm, confident smile in the photos was impossible to ignore. He closed the tab, opened it again, clicked another link. The details piled on relentlessly. Daniel had done exactly what Ethan had mocked for never being able to do. He had started from nothing, and the world had noticed him. The weight of it pressed down on Ethan, tighter than any job rejection or financial setback he had ever endured. He tried to look away, tried to tell himself it didn't matter, but the screen burned in his mind. Daniel's success wasn't just a reminder, it was a mirror. Everything Ethan had taken for granted, Every step he had assumed was owed to him now reflected in stark contrast. And now came the fear, not of failure, not of embarrassment, but of confrontation, because Ethan knew, inevitably, they would meet again. The thought gnawed at him, twisting the gut-tight, hollow feeling in his chest. He imagined the conversation, the calm authority in Daniel's eyes, the quiet power he had cultivated while Ethan had stumbled. Ethan had spent years being almost someone. Daniel had spent the same years building who he was meant to be, and soon the paths would cross. The name on the screen wasn't just a name anymore, it was a warning, because Daniel Reyes never forgot, and Ethan Walker had finally realized the truth. Some debts aren't measured in money, some debts are measured in patience, some debts are measured in silence. The glass building towered above Ethan as he walked up the steps, each one heavier than the last. He'd ironed his only good shirt, rehearsed every line, repeated every answer under his breath. He told himself it was just another job, just another step, but deep down he knew this one was different. When the receptionist called his name, he stood and froze. Daniel Reyes. Not the quiet, worn-down boy from years ago, not the one who had carried his lunch so carefully or who had tolerated Ethan's endless jokes in silence. This Daniel was calm, confident, in a sharp suit, composed, eyes that seemed to measure Ethan with the precision of someone who had never forgotten a detail. "Mr. Walker," Daniel said. His voice was steady, controlled. There was no anger, no smile, just awareness. Ethan swallowed, the rehearsal in his head evaporating like smoke. I'm here for the interview," he stammered. Daniel gestured toward his office. "Please." The office smelled faintly of coffee and subtle authority. Ethan sat across from Daniel, the air between them thick, unspoken, heavy. Daniel skimmed the resume slowly, deliberately, letting every second stretch like a test. Finally, he looked up. "I wondered if we'd meet again." Ethan's throat tightened. Daniel raised a hand, not to silence him, but to steady the moment. "You don't need to explain. I remember who you were, and I know who you are now." The words weren't cruel. That hurt more than anger ever could. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered. Daniel studied him for a long moment. "I know," he said, "because people who aren't sorry make it this far down." A pause. Daniel leaned back, fingers steepled. "Here's the truth. You made my life harder than you ever knew, but you also taught me something valuable." Ethan waited, heart pounding. "That silence doesn't mean weakness," Daniel continued. "It means patience." He slid the resume back across the desk. "I'm not offering you a shortcut. No favors, no protection. You'll start at the bottom, same as I did." Ethan nodded, eyes burning. "That's all I'm asking for." Daniel stood and extended his hand. Ethan hesitated, but then took it. For the first time in his life, every step forward would be earned, and Daniel Reyes would be the one to make sure of it. Ethan walked into the office the first day with a mixture of hope and dread. The suit he wore didn't shield him from reality. The polished shoes didn't erase the years of almosts, the failures, the pride that had been stripped away. Daniel Reyes greeted him at the door, calm, collected, imposing, not in stature, but in presence. "You'll start in the mailroom," Daniel said simply. No preamble, no warmth, just fact. Ethan blinked. "Mailroom?" Daniel's eyes held steady. "Yes, the bottom, the same place I started." Ethan swallowed, expecting a lecture, a speech, maybe even sympathy, but there was none. Daniel continued, "I don't forgive what you did, not because I want to punish you, but because lessons erase learning, and you have a lifetime of lessons to learn." The words landed like stones. Ethan felt the old weight of superiority, the entitlement he had carried for long, crumble in his chest. I understand," he said, voice barely above a whisper.
Daniel leaned back, studying him with quiet intensity. You'll fail more times than you succeed. You'll feel overlooked, underappreciated, frustrated. You'll want shortcuts. You'll want favors. There will be people who test your patience, people who challenge your integrity, and you will have to navigate it all without complaining. Ethan nodded. He wanted to argue, to plead, but the truth in Daniel's eyes made it impossible. "This isn't cruel," Daniel added softly. "It's necessary. Growth doesn't happen in comfort. Respect doesn't happen in entitlement. Redemption doesn't happen without effort." Ethan felt the sting of every joke, every comment, every humiliation he had inflicted on Daniel come alive in the quiet weight of that office. He was starting at the bottom. He was powerless. He had to earn everything. And Daniel Reyes, once the quiet boy at the back of the classroom, was the one holding the measure. "Welcome to your second chance," Daniel said, standing. "Earn it." Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he nodded. For the first time, he understood that mercy wasn't the absence of punishment. It was the presence of truth, and he would face it every day. The first week in the mailroom was brutal. Boxes stacked higher than he could lift comfortably, labels smudged, deadlines pressing like an invisible fist. Each misstep, dropping a package, misfiling an envelope, forgetting a delivery, was felt sharply, a reminder that nothing came easy anymore. Ethan had spent most of his life coasting, relying on charm, wealth, and the quiet deference of others. Here, none of that worked. No one laughed at his jokes. No one admired his polished shoes. No one cared about his name. Daniel watched from across the office, not to mock, not to punish, but to ensure the lessons landed. Calm, patient, unflinching. Ethan fell repeatedly. He wanted to quit. Sometimes he stayed late, exhausted, fingers raw from handling packages, body aching, mind burning with frustration. He wanted shortcuts, favors, a way out, but there was none. Daniel had made sure of that. And slowly, painfully, Ethan began to change.
He learned to organize, to prioritize, to notice the small details that made a big difference. He started listening, really listening, to colleagues, to instructions, to feedback he had once dismissed as irrelevant. Every failure was a teacher, every mistake a mirror of the person he used to be. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling day, a new employee dropped a heavy box, swearing under her breath. Ethan stepped forward instinctively. "Here, let me help," he said calmly. No sarcasm, no superiority, just action. And in that small moment, he realized he had begun to understand something Daniel had known all along. Power without patience and respect was meaningless. Weeks stretched into months. Ethan stumbled, rose, and stumbled again. Each day he felt the sting of earned failure, the grind of effort, the quiet pride of small, genuine progress. And every evening he carried the weight of his past with him, not as shame, but as fuel. The cruelty he had once wielded now pressed him to be better, to notice, to never inflict the same pain on anyone else. Daniel never mentioned the past. He didn't need to. Ethan remembered. He lived it, felt it, and allowed it to shape him. For the first time in his life, success was something he had to fight for. Every small victory burned brighter because it had been earned. And in that struggle, Ethan began to glimpse the man Daniel had always seen him capable of becoming. Not privileged, not entitled, not invincible, but accountable, aware, and human. Months of grueling work had shaped Ethan in ways he never imagined. He understood patience. He understood respect. He understood that every word, every action, every small kindness or cruelty had consequences. And now the final test was in front of him. The company was expanding. A promotion was open. A project that could launch a career.
Ethan had the experience, the diligence, the hard-earned knowledge. He had earned it. But there was a catch. One of the team members, a new hire, quiet, overlooked, was struggling. Mistakes were piling up, frustration mounting. It would have been easy, effortless to step over them, to take credit for their work, to reclaim the power he had once wielded without thought, without care. Ethan paused. The office hummed around him. He thought of the boy he had once mocked in high school, the lunches ruined with jokes, the silence he had ignored, the small cruelties that had left scars he couldn't see. He glanced at the young employee, flustered, unsure, and he remembered Daniel, not just as the one who had forced him to learn humility, but as the one who had taught him to notice, to respect, to act with integrity. Ethan took a deep breath. He stepped forward. He guided, corrected, and encouraged, quietly, firmly, without claiming credit. Every gesture, every word was deliberate, thoughtful, human. It was harder than seizing the promotion, harder than any spreadsheet, any report, any long night of work, because this test wasn't about skill, it was about character. By the end of the week, the team member was thriving, the project succeeded, and Ethan, though no one outside his own conscience might have noticed, felt something he hadn't in years: pride, earned honestly without shortcuts or manipulation. He had passed the test, not because anyone promoted him, not because anyone praised him, but because he had chosen the harder path, the one Daniel had shown him all those years ago. And for the first time, Ethan understood something that couldn't be taught with money, with power, with privilege. True strength wasn't in rising above others, it was in lifting them with you. The final test wasn't on paper, it wasn't in numbers, it wasn't in power. It was in who he chose to be, and this time, he chose right. Ethan Walker sat at his desk one late evening, the office empty except for the hum of fluorescent lights. The promotion he had worked for, the recognition he had earned, felt different now, lighter, not because it was easy, not because anyone had handed it to him, but because he had carried it honestly. He thought of the years behind him, the golden boy who mocked quietly, the small apartment where he learned humility, the endless almosts that had shaped him. And he thought of Daniel Reyes, the boy who had been silent, patient, observant, the one who had endured, who had built something meaningful while Ethan floundered in pride and privilege, the one who refused shortcuts, refused favors, and demanded integrity even when it hurt. Ethan smiled faintly, not out of joy, but understanding. Daniel's silence had been more powerful than any voice, more enduring than wealth, more transformative than punishment. It had been a quiet force shaping the world around him. He realized that silence wasn't absence, it wasn't submission, it wasn't weakness, it was presence. A presence that waited, observed, and grew until it became unavoidable. And sometimes that presence taught lessons no words ever could. Ethan had learned to notice, to respect, to act with care, to lift instead of crush. And though he could never erase the past, he could carry it, shaping every decision, every interaction, every step forward. He leaned back in his chair, letting the quiet of the office settle around him. There was no applause, no ceremony, no grand acknowledgement, just the understanding that some lessons, earned through patience, hardship, and the silence of others, were the ones that mattered most. Outside, the city lights glimmered like the glass house of his childhood, distant and unattainable. Ethan no longer wanted them to define him, because he had learned the truth. Money can disappear overnight. Privilege can crumble in a day. But the way you treat people, the kindness, the respect, the awareness of those often overlooked, stays with you forever. And in that quiet, Ethan Walker finally understood the weight, the power, and the meaning of what silence was building all along. Some lessons are loud, some are quiet, but the ones that shape us often come in silence. So ask yourself, How do you treat the people around you? Do you notice the quiet ones? Do you lift or do you crush? Because what you do today may echo far longer than you think. If this story moved you, hit that like button to show support and subscribe for more tales that inspire, challenge, and make you reflect. And I want to hear from you. Have you ever been like Ethan or like Daniel? Share your story in the comments. Let's start the conversation. Finally, don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a story that could change the way you see the world.